Aliya Robinson. How you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good. I just first off, I want to say thank you because you are a veteran in policy. You're a veteran policy professional. Your resume is just, it's incredible. I mean, you've pretty much have been involved in different governing bodies. You're former executive director of retirement policy, I believe for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce,
Mhm.
former senior vice president, right, of retirement and comp policy for the ERISA industry committee. So you've definitely been around with policy, but you know, before going into a deep dive with all of that, just kind of wanted to start off and see what's your origins? What's Aliya Robinson's origins?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me back. I definitely appreciate being on the podcast again and happy to see that it continues to grow and expand. So, I did not start out thinking I was going to be a lobbyist or even an attorney. That's not something that I knew many people at the time were doing. It was mostly just things I saw on TV. And what I saw on TV about being an attorney was, going into the courtroom and litigating and having those big case trials. I was not interested in that at all. Once I got through college and graduated, the options, not that they were limited, but the options in terms of what I wanted to do, I wanted to stay in school. And so if I wanted to stay in school, there were only a couple of options from there. I knew I didn't want to get a PhD. I didn't want to be in school that much longer. I knew I was not on the medical path. I am very squeamish about blood, so that would not have been a good option for me. So, really at that point, it was law school. And I had other friends going to law school, so decided to go to law school. When I got into law school, it was very different than I had expected. I had a very wonderful college experience of meeting new people, new ideas, new areas of growth. And law school, really, what I tell people, is a trade school. You are learning a trade. So, having not expected that, it was not as great as I thought it was going to be, or as other people might have experienced. And so I had a little bit of a tough time and a tough time figuring out where I was going to go and how to navigate. And in law school, I thought I was going to be a labor lawyer. And it was a very hard field to get into, which is kind of surprising. And when I was talking to people, they said, you should really, well, someone recommended that you should try tax, which sounded incredibly boring to me. And I was like, no, I want to do something that helps people and works with people. And at that point,
Mhm.
someone mentioned ERISA. And they said it's a mix of tax and labor law, and you work with employee benefits. And that sounded interesting to me. So I actually started my career in the tax field and eventually moved over into ERISA.
We probably shouldn't gloss over that you went to Yale University and then you went to NYU. I mean, you can't get bigger than that. So how did you get there? What was that journey like? Because that's not easy, right?
Yeah.
That requires a lot of studying, a lot of planning.
Well, there was a long time that I really downplayed those schools and getting in, but now that I'm so far removed, I'm happy to say, yes, I am proud to say that I went to Yale and NYU. I grew up in Fredericksburg, Virginia, but both of my parents were from New York City and my grandparents. And so they did the opposite of the carpetbaggers. They came back down south. And so I moved to Virginia when I was about 5, and I always tell people New York was, like, in my blood. I never really
Mhm.
felt like a Southerner. I never wanted to stay in the South, and so I knew I would go to school up north. And so I think when I explain to people that my parents were from New York, grandparents are from New York, my family's really from New York, it makes more sense that I went back
Mhm.
north. Yale, excuse me, I went to public school in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Just wanted to see how far I could go and applied. I was pretty full of myself, so I thought I had a 50-50 chance at least of getting in. I was very happy when I got accepted. Of course, I had, as we all do, our safety schools. So I was, I didn't put all my eggs in the Yale basket, but I was very happy that's where they landed. And for NYU, as I said, I don't think I could have gone from Fredericksburg to New York. So New Haven was my in between. But when I came out and went to law school, I will say I did not get into Yale Law. And so I had to make some decisions. And NYU was my decision, and I think it was a great one. I really loved being in New York City for that period of time.
NYU is also a great university. I used to live in New York for a couple years, and the NYU campus is gorgeous. And It's very prestigious, and obviously you have other universities that too. You have Columbia University that's also in the city, and then you have other smaller universities. I think Pace University is out there as well.
Yes, yes. I will say one of the things that one of the reasons I chose NYU is that I did want a larger law school. So I think at the time it was second largest to Georgetown, I believe.
Oh, interesting.
And I'm not sure I would have made that same choice now. And when I hear my colleagues and they talk about the small classroom, the small law school experience. So my classes, we had about, it was like college in terms of the size. There were about 100 kids, 100 students in each class, as opposed to other schools where I think there were more like 20 or 30 in each class. So I wanted that lodge experience. I wanted to be in the city and talking about the city as opposed to Columbia or some of the other ones, Fordham. There's New York Law, there's Pace, there's
Mhm.
tons, but I wanted the larger law school and I wanted to be in New York.
Isn't it more competitive, the bachelor, like the undergraduate program? Isn't that more competitive than like professional credentials, designations?
I don't know. I wouldn't say that, but I will say this and I will tell people this. I think it's hard to do an Ivy League undergrad and an Ivy League grad school. I do think they look for people who don't go to Ivy Leagues for grad school just to vary the experience. So I mean, and there are people who do it definitely who have done both. I just felt like a lot of people I knew who got into, in particular, Yale did not come from, especially
Mm,
Yale.
right. And just curious, are you the first attorney in your family, or did your parents or someone in your family tree have like this legislative policy background?
So I am the first attorney that I know of in my family, but I am a bit unusual in that my grandmother actually has a master or had a master's degree. She was a teacher, and I grew up with her saying she's a teacher in business for high school. And I grew up with her always saying that she had wanted to go to law school. So I have to think that played a little bit in my mind of what I was going to do, get older. And she definitely set that trail for education and for furthering, her disappointment and not being able to go to law school was a little bit of my achievement and my dream in being able to do it.
I love it. Just sometimes being able to, accomplish something that maybe was fully achieved in maybe a prior generation, that's always a badge of honor. And being able to do a little more than the past generations, you know what I mean? So that's great. And I know you mentioned about when you're trying to figure out what specific area of law you
Mhm.
wanted to focus on. You kind it sounds like you kind of stumbled across ERISA by accident. Would that be fair to say?
Very fair, very fair. Like I said, I came out and I did not have a great experience in law school. And I don't mean to say it was awful. It just wasn't as good of an experience as I had in college. And so I really was looking for how was I gonna turn this experience into a career? And it was really the first time I thought about a career. And so I was very fortunate. I think I was looking for lifestyle and life balance even at that point. And at that time, a lot of people the recommendation to me was to go to a consulting firm. And so I actually started my career at what was then Coopers and Lybrand. And what people said was that it was an easier lifestyle than going to a law firm. And the consulting firm focused on tax. And I did that. And I did enjoy it. While I was there, Coopers and Lybrand merged with Price Waterhouse and things changed as they always do. And it was really that change that propelled me to look at other things because I had been working in kind of partnership tax, individual tax, and change to corporate tax. And again, once I made that change to corporate tax, as I mentioned earlier, I really wanted to do something that was more personal and directly related to people. And that's when I started looking at labor law. And that's when someone said, you really should think about this other area since you have the tax experience called ERISA. As I started asking about it, someone did say, especially for women, it's really good because they only work 9 to 5. That was so not true.
Mm,
And turned out not to be at all true. Although I will say it is a good field for women because it's a great area to practice it and very interesting.
absolutely, absolutely. And to your point, I mean, ERISA is. I mean, just look at right the recent changes and proposals that have been coming out. I mean, it's active.
Yeah. I think the person said that originally because if you look at the original statute, and someone actually showed this to me and I found it fascinating. It was like 3 pages front and back, the whole statute. And so they didn't really think it was gonna go anywhere. They didn't think it was gonna be much of an area of practice. They didn't think it was gonna be a field that was really growing. And so I remember the person who told me that was like, I was a young associate, and I really think they were just trying to get rid of me. And at the time he was telling me this, he was a partner in a major law firm. So it really shows the growth of
I
the
see.
statute and how much more important it's become.
And you know what? And I'm glad you mentioned that because transitioning to your career, right? You spent about 15 years at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. What were some of the your proudest accomplishments working for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce as a director of retirement policy, and primarily more with any legislation and anything that you've contributed to?
Sure. Before I go there, there's one pivot I did forget to mention. I started out in consulting firm, did go to a law firm once I left PwC. I ended up at, I think, 2 different law firms. And then at that point, I was about the age or time period where you're thinking about whether or not you're going to make partner or go for that partnership track. And I really felt like the law firm was not for me. I really liked the law and I liked reading about it and learning about it. But I did not like having to apply it over and over and over again.
Mm,
So at that
mhm,
time, I was amending plan documents, retirement plan documents. And, the first one was great. It was exciting. It was challenging. It was new. The second one, great. There's probably some other things that were different from the first. By the time I got to the fifth or sixth, it just wasn't for me, not for me. And I'm not it's just me. It wasn't I just so you're right. And so you're looking at and my dad had always said, "Whatever job you have, look at your boss and see if you wanna do what they're doing." And when I looked at the partners, I just really didn't wanna do that. I didn't. And
mhm,
so at that point, I was about 8 years out of law school. I'm in Washington, DC. And of course, what's big in Washington, DC is policy. And I started talking to a lot of people about policy and what I could do. And I was really looking, I didn't need to stay in ERISA. I was looking for any type of policy work I could get and happened to apply at the US Chamber, and they happened to have this retirement policy position available. And I tell people all the time, my first, until I got to the ERISA industry committee, so those first 5, 6 jobs out of law school, I all got through applying through the classifieds. There was no personal connection. There was no, just a listing in a newspaper or a listing in the job placement center. And that's how I got it. So I go to the US Chamber of Commerce. It was very different doing policy work. I absolutely loved it. This was really the perfect fit for me in terms of job, obviously career. I stayed there almost 16 years. But what I loved was that, where I had been implementing law, at this point, I got to influence the laws before they were implemented. My greatest, achievement, and I'm using air quotes because it wasn't just mine, a lot of other people contributed to that as well, was the Pension Protection Act of 2007. It just really, I think, brought ERISA into the mainstream of how important it was. I think it was a turning point, especially in Congress. When I started lobbying on that provision, I wouldn't even use the word ERISA. I would say I do employee benefits law. But now you can say ERISA and people might not exactly know what it means, but they know what you're talking about and they know it's important in Congress, especially with staff. There were so many things that that bill touched upon that had just been dangling out there, funding rules for pension plans, changes to multi-employer plans, cash balance litigation that had been ongoing for a while, even things in 401k plans. One thing that I think people don't realize is that automatic enrollment was not really a sure thing until the Pension Protection Act of 2007. It had been a sunset provision and it was made permanent in the PPA. And so when you think about all the plans now that use automatic enrollment, it's not even a thought, but it really was pretty novel back then and untested and not really sure whether it was going to be ongoing part of the retirement system. So I will say that obviously is the biggest piece of legislation, and it was the first piece of legislation I worked on, so it always holds a special place in my heart.
The PPA Act, I think that was passed in 2006, right? Give or take. I mean, that's a massive piece of legislation. So you should be
Yeah,
very proud, especially being your first involvement. I mean, that's huge.
yeah.
You mentioned something curious, what's the socialization? What's the process like behind the scenes with getting proposals, getting buy-in from other leaders within Capitol Hill? Can you share a little bit of that process?
Sure. First of all, I think before you even get to Capitol Hill, and this is where I really appreciate having the platform of the U.S. Chamber, you have to have your coalition, your team behind you, a group of people that you don't want to go in and suggest something and then have 15 other people come in and say that's a bad idea. You want to go in with 15 people saying that's a great idea, right? And so, starting even before you go to Capitol Hill, and the chamber again was a great place for this. I was able to work with our members, work with other trade associations to formulate the positions that we thought were best for the retirement industry. And then go up to Capitol Hill. And to your point, it really is relationship building. You're talking to staff members. And again, like I said, these were a lot of staff members who some were experts. There are definitely a core group of experts on the Hill that were really, really daunting. They knew their stuff, but for a lot of the staff, this was the first time they had heard of ERISA. This was the first time they were hearing about these kind of issues. And so there is an education piece that goes along with it. And you're educating them not just about what the statute says, but also about how you want to change it, the impact that will have, any negatives that might be in there, because there's nothing that's, or very few things that were 100% positive, right? What other issues people might have with what you're proposing so that they're prepared to talk about it. And you do that with as many people as will listen to you, as many times as they will listen to you. And you keep doing that as it goes up the chain of legislation as it gets closer to that final piece. After you kind of talk with staff and get that education, then the members get involved and you try and get as many members involved as possible. And you want them not to just know about the legislation, but to really be a champion for the legislation. So we were very fortunate for a very long time in the retirement space to have the familiar names of Portman Cardin, Robert Portman and Benjamin Cardin, who were both started in the House as representatives and then both moved to the Senate. And when they moved, they both across the aisle worked to make retirement issues bipartisan, but also raised the image of the retirement issues and just really were champions. And every time they had a chance, were really the ones who brought it to other members. And we've had others since then, but that's what it takes. It starts with building that coalition on the ground and then working to keep that coalition and building that coalition in Congress as well.
I'm sure it was a very lengthy process, right?
Yes. So I started working at the chamber in 2003. So started working in 2003. The legislation was passed in 2006. It seems like it was a lot longer than that, but that was 3 solid years. And it didn't start out as the Pension Protection Act. It actually started out as a very small bill dealing with funding rules for
Mhm.
pension plans. And just as you went in and talked to people, more things got added and more things got added. So it really was quite the process.
What challenges did you face like that just stands out? Like, wow, that was the biggest hurdle in that whole process.
That there were so many different pieces to it that not everyone had the same concern about every piece of it. And so it's always hard to keep something that big together and making it all the way through legislation. So there were times when people were like, well, if someone doesn't like this piece, can't we just get rid of it? But especially at the US Chamber, where I had a very broad membership base, there were no pieces that I could get rid of. So making sure all those pieces stayed together, any changes that people suggested were agreeable across the membership base, those were the biggest challenges.
How did you work your magic? Because that's hard to try to convince people to, that's hard. Human
It is
relationship
hard.
is so, it takes so much energy. How did you do that?
I think it's just talking to people and making sure that they're heard. It's also, I am dealing with people who are running businesses. And I think the biggest understanding that I try and give to them is that government doesn't work at the pace of business. And so a lot of times it was taking them up to meet with staff and meet with members and giving them that experience that I had every day so that they can see for themselves. So this isn't, taking it to a board of 15 people. This is taking it to a body of, over 500 people that have to agree on this. And then when they see kind of the magnitude of that, I think they're more understanding about the time it takes, about the negotiations that need to be made, and just those kind of challenges.
From what I am gathering, it looks like it really involved not just, you knowing the legislation, what's going to be proposed, right? Knowing it back, detail to detail, but also developing the relationships, coordinating events, probably several events, several meetings, kind of playing that middle liaison person. That's a lot, and I'm sure this was probably 7 days a week, several times throughout this whole process, right? Where it's like you're on all day trying to get this to maybe not necessarily pass, but at least for your coalition leaders to agree this is
Yep.
good, right? This is
It
a
was
good idea, right?
it was a full-time job. So we did have a coalition that we built through the US Chamber of Companies and other trade associations. I believe for most of that time, that coalition met every week to, talk about our plans, our lobbying, our strategy. We also, you have, as I mentioned, a lot of education. So putting together PowerPoints, talking one pagers, talking points, et cetera, et cetera. That was all happening. Also during that time, Congress was holding hearings. So trying to make sure if our members were part of those hearings, getting them ready,
Hmm.
asking them to testify, sitting with them, preparing them, being with them during that. That all happened. And also, the other piece of this that's equally important are the agencies. So, we also spent time at the Department of Labor and the Treasury Department preparing them for legislation that we were asking for. So, you're right. It was a lot of time. There were a lot of, Congress goes in cycles. So, there were periods of breaks, but during those break periods, again, in air quotes, you're setting up your strategy, you're getting ready, and you're ready to just go at it again.
Just curious, how did you, because that's a lot, right? That is a full-time position and then some. How did you balance that with, like, I don't know, just your well-being, your personal life balance? How was that? How did you manage that during that time?
So, I think when you're in that kind of job and this kind of job, lobbying is a lot of relationships. People become your friends. And so you do feel like you're spending time with your friends. Not everybody, for sure. But you do build a good group of people that I am still very close with, that I work with, that even if they've moved on to different issue areas, still stay in touch with. So that helps because it's not like work and then home. There
Mhm.
is a blending of the 2. But having said that, I think, for me, there were times when I definitely made that separation. My family lives here in Virginia, and so I was fortunate that they were close enough that I could take time to go see them on a regular basis. I kept personal hobbies and things like that. So, it's a blending of both. You definitely want work to be, for me, it was a social outlet as well as a professional outlet, but I definitely had my own personal and family outlets separate from that.
I feel like, and I feel like that's, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from what, and outside of the ERISA space, right? Just politics in general, right? You have different sides. Is that missing nowadays where it's like that joint, just kind of coexisting, you know, being able to separate from, the policy and just seeing the human aspect, the relationships. Do you think that's missing today in the political scene?
Yeah. So that's a tough one because when I started, there were people in the field who had been doing this for 20 or 30 years, and they said, things are just not the way they used to be. And now I feel like I'm that person saying that. So, it's true. I will say more, it's definitely true. But I think it's just representative of what's going on in our society in general. And I do think post COVID, and there's so many things that are great about the virtual aspects and virtual world and being able to do things and talk to people, across countries, across time zones, etc. But one thing that I think has been a real negative is that human interaction. And we see that even with the coalition, right? You used to have these great coalition meetings with 20 to 30, 40 people in person, and everybody's giving their opinion, and you're hashing things out, and you're really, able to come up with ideas and find flaws in ideas, build upon ideas. And it happens virtually, but it's not the same, and I don't think you get the same input, and I think that translates into Congress as well. I think many, many of the congressional leaders will tell you that they became friends not over a political issue, but over a social interaction. And so if you don't have that social interaction, then you are losing that ability to build those relationships that can become professional.
I appreciate that insight because at the end of the day, policy are ideas, right?
Hmm.
Humans make ideas, right? And
Right.
so without having human coexisting and, having you know, being able to come to an agreement, ideas just don't get on paper. They don't get passed and it just becomes this very chaotic, I don't even know what to call it, like process,
Yeah, ideas they need input, right? And so I can come up with an idea, but it's just me and my existence with my input, and that's it. And the more people you get involved, I think the better the ideas become because you get different perspectives, different needs, different concerns, different ideas that build upon that. And so, yeah, I think what Congress doesn't want or shouldn't want are static ideas that are just coming from one place, one voice without any other input. Unfortunately, that seems to be happening more, but part of my job is to make sure that that doesn't happen.
And you touched on something that I actually did want to get into a little bit. You mentioned about potential static ideas and ideas that may be either antiquated or ideas that may just be really held closely to a certain group of individuals. With that being said, what do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of employer provided benefits on Capitol Hill with that type of maybe ideology or just misconceptions?
I, I think the misconception I run into the most, and I will say, especially working in financial services, is that employers don't want to be helpful. And it's very interesting to me and a little bit confusing because the employee benefits are voluntary. And so if an employer didn't
Mhm.
want to be helpful, they don't have to offer them. But they do. And when they do, it's almost as if they're treated as if they're trying to um, cheat their employees. And so that is a perspective that we are that in particular, I'm always trying to undo and to explain that the benefits a lot of times what employers are complaining about are not the benefits being provided, but some of the extraneous rules and regulations that are put in place in order for them to provide the benefits. So the example I always like to use, I'm a person, I do not mind paying taxes. I think they're important. I think, and we can debate about what they're used for, but I think in general, I don't have a problem paying taxes. I do have a problem filing my taxes because it is so annoying and the returns and things like that. And so I think it's the same for employers.
Mhm.
Providing the benefit isn't the problem, it's the process that the right rules and regulations have set up.
And so I'm assuming you're referring to the 5500 forms, you're referring to non-discrimination testing, right?
Yes. Yeah. There's a place for this, but when it becomes so convoluted, I will say one area that flies way below the radar, but every employer has an issue with is the number of disclosure requirements that are in ERISA. Having to provide notice on every single thing you do and separately and having to provide it a lot of times until recently in paper or by the mail. You couldn't even do it electronically was a frustration of many, many employers. So something you think is not a big deal, providing notice and you think is a good thing. But when you have to provide, I think we did a calculation one time when I was at the chamber, and that's now been almost 10 years ago. If you look at all you have to disclose for retirement plans and healthcare plans, and most people who offer retirement plans do also offer healthcare plans, it was over 300 different types of notices every year. So there's no way that an employee is reading all of those. They're definitely not, understanding all of those. And so, but there's every time they implement a new disclosure requirement in ERISA, nobody looks back to see, hey, how does this fit in with all the other one? And so we've just kept adding on and adding on until Secure 2.0. Congress now has directed the agencies to take a look at that. And so we're hoping that will be helpful.
And I'm glad you brought up Secure Act 2.0, but before we kind of transition to that, I hear you because I'm a plan sponsor and we have various retirement plans, 403B, 457B, which is non-qualified. There's still regulation, there's still notices required. Yeah, I mean, you go from annual funding notice, the 403B fee notice, safe harbor notice. I mean, there's so many annual, auto enrollment, 30-day, 90-day there's a lot. But I feel like though there was good intentions, right? Because the whole purpose is and to your point, people don't read these. I mean, this is just it's just you emailed the form that you spent a lot of time trying to like get the legal verbiage right and everything. People don't read them. All they care about is you look at your benefit statement. Cool. I got this amount from my employer. I defer this. Great. Right. They're very simple. But I think the idea behind it, and correct me if I'm wrong, was to be transparent, right? To try to be transparent with the participants,
Absolutely.
trying to disclose here's your investment fees, here's what's in your investment menu, here's the safe harbor notice, this is what this means. Is that the original idea behind all these disclosures?
Absolutely. And this is a great example and an idea needing other input and other perspectives, right? So, absolutely, you want to be transparent. You want to tell participants what's going on. And Congress says, there's a rule change, something happens, let's make sure participants are aware, let's give them a notice. But if you don't have plan sponsors coming in, if you don't have participants coming in saying this is too many, then you just get notices on top of notices on top of notice we've had. I will give one caveat to what you said. People don't read notices until they need them, right? And so
Absolutely.
so
Absolutely.
in this idea of trying to build transparency, we've kind of made it more opaque by bombarding them with so many notices. So one thing about electronic disclosure is really having things housed or placed so that people can get to them easily when they need them.
I agree with you in that people don't need something until it's an emergency. Beneficiary forms is one. Someone gets divorced, someone passes away. Now it's, where do I have the paper? I'm like, well, I sent it to a couple, you know what I mean? So
Right.
it's just human nature. This is just who we are, you know what I mean? Unfortunately. And it's not just ERISA, it's
No.
medical, you
Yep.
know, I am the stereotypical male where it's like, I feel fine. I can skip the physical, the yearly physical, you know what I mean? Until like, I'm gasping for air and it turns out I have diabetes or something, you know what I mean? Like I'm one insulin shot away from dying, you know what I mean? Then I want the help, right? So,
Right.
so no, totally hear you. But I'm glad you brought up Secure Act 2.0, right? And so we're seeing a lot of the new features, right? Roth catch up coming up and all these rollouts coming up. What parts of this law do you think is working well? And which areas do you think might be creating more challenges than needed?
So we skipped over Secure One. It went from PPA. We had some other stuff in between. So Secure One was 2019. So that was really a long time. And that was a lot of coalition building. It was a lot of building across the aisles. But what I say about Secure One is that it was really for plan sponsors. It did a lot of administrative work in terms of simplification. It added pooled employer plans. But it really, if you had to say like who not benefited, but who was really impacted, it was plan sponsors. And it really was the goal was to simplify the retirement system, especially in the defined contribution space. But when we look at Secure 2.0, there were over, I think, 90 provisions, and about 80 of them were optional provisions. And I think that's important because it was really focused on plan participants and trying to build in provisions that were important to plan provisions. So I think we have Secure One that, help plan sponsors with administrative simplification. And now we have Secure Two that's really helping participants where they are to help them save more for retirement. So we see a lot of things like emergency savings. We see a lot of withdrawal provisions for like disease, for adoption, things like that, which seem a little bit counterintuitive. But the hope is that if you can give people help in these certain situations, it will help them to continue saving during those periods. Because once people get out of the system, it's really hard to get them back in. And so we want to keep them in during those periods.
Hmm.
So you mentioned the Roth catch up. That is giving
Hmm.
people a lot of heartburn. So this provision requires that any catch up contribution that is made by a person making over $140,000 must be made as a Roth contribution. So this requires system changes in terms of making sure you capture those people. It has required a lot of guidance from the Department of Labor in terms of how to implement this provision. There's a lot of definitions. the definition of how you calculate the $140,000, whether you have to aggregate across employers or not, what happens if there's a mistake. So we have finally gotten final rules from the Treasury Department. Kudos to them. They were able to put them out before the government shutdown. And so we are working, our teams are working really day and night to get this implemented by the first of the year.
Just curious, what was the thoughts behind that to require Ross for catch up, super catch up? What was the idea behind that proposal?
Sure. So every bill in Congress is supposed to be pay for itself. So when you
Mm,
have a bill, there's supposed to be things that cost money, and then you have things that provide money, and those should cancel out. And for Secure 2.0, they did. But one of the way you get them to cancel out is by raising revenue. And Roth contributions raise revenue because the other important piece of this is that you're only looking at a 10-year window, which for retirement purposes, we have always felt to be a little bit of a false premise because it's not tax free, it's tax deferred, but usually outside of that 10-year window. So for the budget, it looks like it's tax free. So for Secure 2.0, the Roth contributions within the 10-year window, you're paying taxes on that. And so it's a revenue raiser. And really, this was done to pay for other portions of the bill that were taking away from revenue. Uh, And so you have that piece, you want Roth, you want it for the catch-up contributions, but we have the $140,000 because the feeling is that you don't want people on the lower wage spectrum or the lower wage spectrum to have to pay the taxes up front. It would be more of a burden. So you're trying to get enough money to pay for the rest of the bill, but just enough so that you're not impacting people who are on the lower end of the wage spectrum.
this is great insight knowledge because, well, I have two questions, right?
Uh,
How is it projected the amount of revenue that will come from the taxes? That's my first question. How is that? What's behind the scenes on that? How does that formulated?
So that is really behind the scenes. So as I said, there's a 10-year window, and the Joint Committee on Taxation, this is their job to figure out how much money will be raised, lost, etc. So, but in general, anything that goes into a 401k plan pre-tax is considered a revenue loser because you're not paying taxes on it right away. Anything that, such as Roth, either the 401k or IRA, is considered a revenue raiser because you are paying tax on it right away. And then there might be some other things here or there. The withdrawals, because there's, you paying a tax on that with your withdrawal. When you withdraw, it can be a raiser. In terms of the actual numbers, that's up to the Joint Committee on Taxation to figure out how many people they think will be encouraged to maybe put something more money into their 401k. How many people will be encouraged to do the Roth? And how they figure out those numbers is really internal to them. But generally, that's how it works.
And my follow-up question to that is, the argument's always been get taxed now, not later. But let's be honest though, what's the guarantee that the taxes that are going to be paid now won't be taxed again after being paid up front? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I have heard that argument, and
Mm,
all I can say is that's the law right now, and you are right. Any
mhm.
future Congress can change the law in the future, but I think it's up to people like us to make sure that if that becomes an idea, we explain how bad of an idea it would be and convince Congress not to do it.
Mm. I had another question about the that compensation minimum threshold. So that number, because because that 145, 140, in Texas, Florida, Tennessee, no state income, that's a lot of money. But you look at California, all the West Coast states, you look at all the East Coast states, that's like you're making enough to like, to live a decent living, but that's not really high wage earners. So how did that get all calculated?
So that is a big issue in general. When you were talking about discrimination testing earlier, it's really between high wage earners and low wage earners. But that number, and don't test me on that now, I think it's about 180 maybe? Maybe.
Mm,
And that might be on the high end. We are not talking about C-suite. We're not talking about millionaires. We are talking about, depending on where you live, low to middle income. So it is hard because ERISA is a national law that applies across all 50 states. And so you are trying to find that middle ground that you are hitting it as a highly compensated employee is high enough to actually be highly compensated in places like California and New York, but not to be so extreme that you cannot pass discrimination testing in other places where the salaries aren't as high. And discrimination testing means that someone who is highly compensated cannot benefit more than someone who is below that compensation level. So if you're in places where nobody is meeting that highly, or everybody is over the highly compensated limit, then, you're not passing that test. So it's a compromise.
Yes, and I think that everything you just mentioned is things that plan sponsors really don't fully grasp because this isn't what they do, right? They provide a different type of service, revenue. So employee benefits is just an afterthought. But plan sponsor plans are complicated. Non-discrimination tests, ADP tests, 410B coverage tests, top heavy, you know what I mean? It's very, very complicated. And you've made a valid example of how it can be complicated. So, we can definitely appreciate the careful thinking, right, when it comes to legislative proposals, because it does require a think tank, a group of
Mhm.
individuals to really think of all these
Yep.
things that average person doesn't really think about, right? I was going to ask you, you've clearly you're a veteran, you're a seasoned policy professional. How does, with all this experience that you've collected within, the US Chamber of Commerce and the ERISA committee, how has that helped you in your current role with T. Rowe Price, and how is that different from your advocacy role to now being kind of in this private sector, you know?
Right. That's a great question. And I really have enjoyed the transition from trade association into working, for a company at T. Rowe Price. And I thought, I'll take it in two steps. I thought the biggest difference would be that, I went from working for several hundred members to working for one company, and I would just have one goal, idea, whatever that I was going to put forth. That turned out not to be true. Even within the company, there are different ideas, there are different goals, there are different things that are happening. So some of that coalition building I'm still doing just on a internal level instead of across different types of companies. I'm just doing it in this one company. The biggest change is that I work more with our trade associations than directly with Congress. It is important that our trade associations know where we are. And having been on that side of it, I think I appreciate more now how difficult it is to create that united voice. Sometimes because you're not hearing from everybody, sometimes because you're hearing from more than one voice in the organization. Um, and sometimes just because people have different ideas, different industry, different people might have different perspectives. And so being on this side of it, having, my voice, my perspective, my company's voice, my company's perspective is very interesting to talk to the trade associations and get that voice across and then take that to Capitol Hill.
And I'm assuming, in your current role, are you working closely with like the human resource, the benefits, total rewards department with T. Rowe Price, or is it more of outside involvement, not necessarily internal involvement?
It's both. So I work with our internal human resources on our internal benefits and plans in terms of advocacy and rules that are coming down, but also working from the perspective of a service provider and
Uh,
how laws and rules might impact our clients and our partners and wanting to make sure that we're representing them and that we're in lockstep with them as well.
and I have to ask this because at the end of the day, we're all human beings, right? And life isn't black and white. There's a lot of gray, right? And
Mhm.
human factors play into the role. You and I being people of color, there's things that, you might have to overcome to maybe get your idea out and let's be honest, be respected at a certain level with a colleague that may not be of that group, right? What has
Right.
been your experience with, within the Capitol Hill, the policy arena, and then also this new private sector world? How has all that come into play?
It's a great question. I remember asking this when I was junior and kind of being frustrated with more senior folks, but I understand it now. It really is doing the job and just doing it to the best of your ability and letting that be the proof. And I say I was frustrated because I'm like, of course I'm going to do that. But, you know, how does that change anything? But it really does. And it's, if you're doing your job, if you are continuing to push forward, continuing to do the best that you can do the best for your members, do the best for the company, people appreciate and see that. And that tends to overcome the negative things that are out there.
And, just curious again, because you have a very unique, upbringing, right? With,
Hmm.
your grandmother having the masters, but then, your parents moving from north to south, and
Right.
just a different upbringing than perhaps other individuals that, got their education in New York City and all that. What with your unique upbringing, what unique perspectives, ideas did you bring to the table, when you're at the US Chamber of Commerce, at T. Rowe Price, at Eric? Can you share some of that?
Sure. And I should say, in addition to doing the job, doing it well, don't be afraid to bring up your perspective. Your perspective can add value, can add change, can make the idea more valuable. So, one thing I would always say, and I still say this, as a woman, I tell people times have changed, and not only that times have changed, but particularly for women of color, a lot of the rules that were meant to protect them actually harm them. And, one thing is the spousal consent. I bring up the conversation, not that this harmed my mom, but my mom, when she was a housewife for most of my life, and when she went back to work, she was very successful, and she worked in a hospital. She had a 401(k) plan. And I remember she came to me and she was like, "Can you believe they are making me get your dad sign this for me for my money?" And I was like, "Wow, I need to take her to Capitol Hill to tell people that she does not like this rule that's meant to protect her." So I think giving your perspective and, telling people that it's not always what they think is equally as important as doing the job. So that's one way. I come from a very working class family. Even though my grandmother got her master's, neither one of my parents got their college degrees. They both went, but they didn't finish until much later in life. So they were both blue collar. My dad was blue collar. My mom worked in a hospital. So I had the experience of people who were not, those highly compensated employees. I had the experience of people who did not have generational wealth, who were not familiar with investing. And so one perspective I think that was always important that I think I brought was that for most people, my siblings included, myself included, the 401(k) was the first time we had experience, firsthand experience with investing. And whether we needed more protection or less protection, more freedom, less freedom, I was able to bring, I think, that perspective and say, this is the experience that I've had, this is the experience I've had within my family. And I think it's important that we consider that when we make these laws and rules.
And by the way, I really appreciate that, what you just shared, because at the end of the day, right? Yes, there's education requirements to check off a box, like to qualify for a role, but to really excel in a role, you got to be authentic. You got to be,
Exactly.
obviously respectful, right? Respectful,
Right.
but within your parameters. And I just recently interviewed a gentleman, Charles Blaine, who's a young professional man in Houston, and he's become this famous political analyst because he's been able to find his niche,
Mhm.
and being able to being authentic. And
Yes.
I don't think it really matters what field you're in. Obviously, you have to be competent in what you're doing,
Right.
but throw in your flair, throw in your side. You know what I mean? Like,
It's funny you say that because I think, you're absolutely right. But on the other hand, I tell women especially, it's okay to not be the loudest person in the room. Especially when I was growing up, I was always told to speak louder, speak more, da da da. And you wouldn't believe it now because I talk all the time. But I was shy. But I used that to my advantage. It was very easy for me. It was much easier for me, and still is, to make a one-on-one connection than to go in a room and wow like 20 people.
absolutely.
But use that to your advantage. I tell people don't try and shrink away, as to your point, from your authentic self. If you don't want to talk to 50 people, don't talk to 50 people. Talk to five and make those really good conversations that will go forth and, help you instead of 50 conversations that aren't going to do anything for you.
Absolutely. I'd say one relationship at a time. And I'm assuming that's probably what you had to do when you were trying to, build that coalition team for the PPA, right? It was one conversation at a time, you know, convincing, John Smith and and whoever else
Yeah,
was the next person that you had to like check off your list, right? As they'll be on the team. Yeah.
exactly, and being strategic about those one conversations at a time. I mean, there are people, and it doesn't, I've met these people and they're great. They can go talk to anybody at any time about anything, no problem. I'm not one of those people. I don't automatically make connections like that. So for me, it was strategic, and I think this goes back to what you're saying about, kind of building. There might be people that are not always in your corner. Perhaps those are not the people you should talk to first. Let's start with people who are going to be receptive, who are going to you might have something in common with, and you start building your relationships that way and gaining traction that way rather than maybe starting with the person who's not going to give you the most reciprocity.
That's just great advice, especially with someone as accomplished as you. You know,
Thank
I
you.
think that just validates that mindset, right? It's authenticity. Obviously knowing your craft, but don't be scared of being yourself. Aliya Robinson, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being part of the podcast.